let me just get us over onto Facebook and, talk amongst yourselves. Y'all were so yappy earlier. Now you're all quiet because we're live.
I don't know where we're at.
We're not anywhere yet.
Okay. Now I'm nervous to say too much.
I'm used to doing these things by myself, so it's nice to have a moderator and just be able to sit back and relax.
Are you doing a lot of virtual tastings for the club?
Not recently, but definitely last spring and summer, there was quite a few, and you're running the whole hour by yourself pretty much, and you kind of get used to that. And this format, you're just like, it's a breeze. I don't have to do anything but just talk a little bit.
Likewise, we did a bunch in summer last year. Got a big one coming up on Saturday, like 500 people. But
wow.
Right, yeah, it's one of these things where you send a sample. Somebody splits the bottles up set and sends samples everywhere and does it all for you. That's a Napa gig, so we're in on that.
Nice.
Yeah, but normally when you have to talk an entire hour by yourself, it's a marathon.
And then we did one with National Geographic, which was kind of cool too. That was a big one.
Nice. That sounds really cool.
I got in that one for my caving stuff, so that was kind of cool. But yeah.
Bar that's telling me it's mirroring to Facebook, so
yeah. So we got to be cool.
I'm just trying, it's the technology.
Once on my end, we're streaming.
Push one button and it'll just go, All right, cool. We are live on Facebook. Excellent. So, and we're getting a few people jumping on, I hope. Let's see. Have a look over there.
I knew it. My dogs are going to start barking.
You got a new puppy, Damian?
Yeah, we got one of Kit's puppies. She's just becoming a bit of a handful.
Hard to call her a puppy at this point. She's huge.
Yeah. And she likes jumping up and she's into everything and chewing everything. I bought her a buffalo horn yesterday, like a whole one. So apparently the buffalo horn is kind of the in thing for dogs to chew on, and it doesn't hurt them, and it's, they love it. This one was a bit dried out maybe, but she's getting onto it now.
Alrighty. I'm wondering if we're having an issue with the link, but we're going to go anyway, and people can watch that. So, but I think we're having link issues over on the Zoom side of things. So, cool. All right, right on. Let's go.
Is there any?
Welcome everybody to another Paso Wine Hour. I'm Chris Toronto with the Paso Robles Wine Country Alliance, and today we are talking to 3 winemakers about late ripening varieties, or varietals, I suppose, once it's in the bottle. Why? Actually, a past show, it was mentioned, and then somebody commented and said, hey, that would be a good show. You should do that. And I'm like, oh, well, all right, well, let's do that. So that's what we're doing today, is talking to 3 people who make excellent wine, of course, in Paso, who doesn't? But also I chose them specifically because I know that their programs are have a lot of these late ripening varieties involved in what it is that they do. So today we have Molly Lonborg with Alta Colina Winery. Hey, Molly. Ryan Pease with Terre, and Damian Grindley with Brecken Estate. I want to give each of them just a quick second to say hello and talk a little bit about their brand. So, Molly.
Sorry, the internet. I had a little instability there.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate you having Alta Colina and myself on this webinar. And Ryan Pease, thank you very much for sharing the wonderful grape of Mourvèdre with me to allow me to present our sun worshiper. So yeah, I'm the winemaker here at Alta Colina. I've been here for about a year now. Alta Colina is located in the Adelaida district. We're all estate vineyard, all Rhone varietals. So we grow 8 different Rhones and everything's organically farmed. The winery is located on the property here, but the vineyard is up on the top of the mountains. So we have a high elevation vineyard site that produces some amazing grapes of high intensity. So it's been a really fun site for me to work at. And yeah, I'm just continuing on the legacy of Bob Tillman and his daughter Maggie, who own the winery here. And Bob has been the winemaker since the beginning days, and he has very graciously passed the reins over to me. So I'm very excited to be here now and making some fun wines. And later we're gonna try our Sun Worshipper blends.
Awesome. Thank you, Molly. That was great. Molly said thank you to Ryan for sharing Mourvèdre, because Ryan and Paix, Terre, basically his whole thing is Mourvèdre. And then I asked him, hey, Ryan, can you do Picpoul Blanc instead so I can fit Molly in? And he was into it. He did it. And thank you for that, Ryan. Ryan, Paix, Terre, please.
Yeah, I'm Ryan Pease, owner and winemaker of Paso Robles. We tend to focus on the blending grapes of the Rhone Valley and kind of show that blending grapes don't have to be blending grapes, that if they're farmed really well and they're on great dirt and they're given a lot of care in the winery, they can be just as good as Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvèdre. And that's basically my favorite thing to do, is take the geekiest varietals within the Rhone world and try to make a truly special 100% rendition of such without any blending or doing anything to it, essentially, and just showing the purity of the grape. And that's kind of our end game with things for the most part. Alta Colina is one of the sites that we work with Mourvèdre and make a beautiful 100% whole cluster Mourvèdre from. So yeah, I mean, we are heavy in that department, but our white program and our Picpoul program is a big part of what we do as well too. And I love making white wine, so I was happy to take the Picpoul end of things. And it is probably the latest ripening white wine grape in Paso, minus a few little pockets of some geeky things, but consistently is one of the later grapes. But we make about 1,500 cases a year. I also was just hired a year ago, almost to this week, as the winemaker at Brecken. And so I have my hands in that one as well too. But Damian made the wine that we're talking about today. And obviously Damian's a huge, still and remains and will be a huge part of what Brecken does there. So I'm just happy to be on board and be a part of it and be a support system for helping them progress as a brand and continuing to be even more successful than they have to date. So kind of a fun tasting today, because I kind of have a hand in all these vineyards and all these sites in a lot of ways, and kind of fun to have this discussion today. So I'm looking forward.
Right on. So, and speaking of Damian Grindley with Brecon Estate. Welcome on.
Hey, everybody. Hello, everybody. So we actually brought Brecon Estate back, I think, in October 2012. And if I remember right, it was the 12th of October. And they hadn't harvested anything. And so about 3 weeks later, the frosts were due. And all of a sudden, we're out there in the first week of November, running around and picking the Cabernet Sauvignon and the Cabernet Franc that was on the property. And now, of course, Brecken's evolved since then, and we planted some other things, such as Petit Verdot and Malbec and some more Cab Franc. But the original plantings of Cab and Cab Franc are still there, and they still come in the last week of October, first week of November. Which really means, as a winemaker, you don't see Thanksgiving, or very rarely, because you're still punching down and processing. So the wife wasn't very happy, but we didn't tell her that before we bought the winery. The Cab Franc that we're pouring today, yes, we picked it in the first week of November. The Somm Journal just wrote it up. It got a 97, and as of this morning, we only had 100 bottles left. So we're up against, I almost switched to wine on you at the last minute because I thought it was going to be gone. But that's in their March issue. They haven't actually published it yet. I think published it on March 1. So, but the word is getting out. So anyway, that's Brecken. And I think we want to start getting rolling, I suspect.
Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for sharing it then with us. I didn't realize that. So that's really cool and really special. So I know we're going to enjoy it. So Paso has a really long growing season here. That's one of the things that makes us really unique about Paso is that we basically have this amount of time spent on the vine that can get just about anything ripe and actually bring it to its true ripeness, to true like typicity, if you will. And so we're able to see so many different things grown here. About 64 is our count right now as to how many varieties are grown in Paso. And as we are having this unique kind of growing environment here, it allows people to play with things like, let's just say Mourvèdre or Cab Franc, where they can actually be standalone. They don't have to be blended necessarily to have to augment anything. It can be 100% varietal. It can also blend in really well. But that's what's really cool about Paso is that we have such a unique area to grow grapes in. And these three know way more about it than I do. And I want to kick it to them actually to talk a little bit about the growing season. And I want to start with Molly, because Molly, you worked over at Alta Ranch for a while. You've been in this region. Talk a little bit about the growing season and a little bit of what makes it unique. And as a winemaker, of course, being able to work with so many different varieties that this region can work with.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, as Chris mentioned, I started at Alta Ranch. I was there for almost 9 years before coming here to Alta Colina. So starting at Alta, we had 21 varietals, got down to about 14. So I loved it though. I felt like we were always so lucky being here in Paso, because as winemakers, we like to think of ourselves as artists, you know, where some winemakers get one or two colors to play with. And in Paso, we have this full palette of colors. And then within those different colors or varietals, we have clones that we can play around with. So the experimentation is just amazing. And that's one thing that's drawn me to stay here in Paso. I'm from Northern California, and I think all of my friends and family thought I would get into wine and just move back north. But I've just loved the varieties that we get to work with here, especially Rhone varietals have taken my heart. So most of my career in Paso Robles has been, well, all of my career has actually been in the Adelaida district. So we're talking on the west side of Paso. And as Chris mentioned, we have a very long growing season. And the other thing that is really unique about our area is our diurnal temperature swing. So even though it's about a 45-minute drive to actually get to the Pacific Ocean, as the crow flies, we're 10 to 12 miles, depending where your vineyard site is. And what's really neat is that allows us to get these hot daytime temperatures. So, in the summertime, it's not uncommon to be up at 100 or above 100, but we have about year round 30 to 50 degree diurnal temperature swings. So even though we're up at 50 in the daytime, we're still dropping down, up at 100 in the daytime, we're still dropping down to the 50s at night, which is pretty incredible. And what that does is it really allows the vines to then relax and go to sleep at night. And the other thing that's really unique about our area is here on the west side of Paso, it's all this coastal mountain range. And if you have to think about it, we used to be under the ocean floor millions of years ago. So, through tectonic activity, we have then created this coastal mountain range. So you have all of these pockets of high calcareous soils, which, pretty much just millions of years of decomposed sea animals and seashells that have then created these very basic soils, which actually help maintain acidity. And we get that. And then we have a lot of fault lines in the area. So we actually have a lot of pockets of siliceous vineyards. And here at Alta Colina, we're a completely siliceous vineyard. So where I came from working with calcareous soils, and now I'm in a completely different zone. And I'm literally a couple miles away from the old vineyard where I worked. So it's really neat. And then there's even these super cool pockets of volcanic activity here. So you know, you'll find in the Adelaide district alone, we have 2 or 3 volcanic plugs. And that's really interesting because it creates a completely different type of minerals that then creates different types of clay. And so all of that is then paired with what normally we're supposed to have a decent amount of rain, which I'm sure we'll get into our cool storm we just had. But sadly, the drought, we've had some rough years. But we've got these super cool soils. We have these really interesting diurnal temperature shifts. And that paired with heat for a long time just allows us to ripen almost any varietal.
Yeah, that's great. Damian, you've made wine in a few different places around the world. Compare or contrast Paso to some other environments that you've made wine in, especially with this long growing season that we have. Did he freeze? There he is.
Oh, I didn't exactly hear that question. I'm not sure it was you or me was breaking up there. It looks like it's me, actually. So we may have to skip to Ryan for a while if it's not working for you. But there's a key point. There is a key point here. Just because you're picking a variety late in the season doesn't mean it's a late variety. For example, if I was making wine in a very extreme area or a marginal area, you might be picking Pinot Noir in late October because you're just so far north or so far south if you're in the southern hemisphere. That doesn't make Pinot Noir a generally considered later ripening variety. It's just more to do with the specific climate or microclimate where you are. So what we're trying to talk about here is varieties that everything else being equal and being the same, it would come in late in the season. But there's a double-edged sword to that, and that is often those varieties, those same varieties that harvest late, bud out late and flower late. And that's when you're in the west side of Paso Robles here and you've got these rolling hills, and if you're on the top of the hill, you've got one microclimate. If you're where we are, which is sort of like towards where we've got hilltops, but we were also in a little bit of a bowl, but we're not at the bottom of the bowl, you can also get the possibility of late spring frosts. So that's why we know who it was. Art Norma originally planted the Brecken estate, that they planted late budding and late flowering varieties. Now those same varieties are the same ones that are late ripening varieties. So that's why we've got Cab Franc, that's why we've got Petit Verdot, that's why we've got Cabernet Sauvignon, because they're all traditional Bordeaux varieties and they have the same issue. It's a continental climate, most of Europe. And in some years, those frosts come in late April. So they want varieties that are bud out late and flower late to avoid those spring frosts. Now, the flip side of that is they can become so late in somewhere that has a nice cool climate with the diurnal swings that Molly was talking about. We get these great long hang time. It can push you right up against the rains and the frosts at the other end. And that's where Brecken is. We're hanging and hanging and hanging, and we're getting past a lot of those green characters that you can see in other appellations, and we get the stuff truly ripe. But in the first week of November, traditionally the rains come in the second week of November, and the frosts come maybe the 10th or 12th of November on average. So we're pushing right up against that. And some years the frosts are due and we're just picking. So key points here that, not to be confused with varieties that are planted in marginal locations and they come in late. And also it's often an effect of trying to avoid spring frost. So some varieties, Pinot Noir has quite a short growing season. So, if it buds out early, it's going to come in early. If it buds out late because it's cool, it's still going to come in relatively early. But Cab Franc is traditionally one of the later ones. And then, we've got the oldest Cab Franc vines in Paso Robles. And, by the time they get old, they get a few little viruses and a few other weird little things, and they struggle a bit more. And ironically, that pushes you even later. So Cab Franc and a lot of other people's Cab Francs in similar places might be coming in a week or two earlier, but these old white wine ones just need a little more time. And so that's part of it. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. Ryan can carry on this discussion.
And Ryan, I'd like to hear from you. You know, you've worked with fruit from all over this AVA, and while we're all kind of talking Adelaida district, I mean, you're eventually going to be talking about Picpoul, but you'll also be kicking in on Mourvèdre. But when it comes to white wines here in the Paso region, and you had mentioned you've made some white wines, and I've had some very good white wines of yours from when you've made wines for other producers as well. How does that fit into this long growing season? Like, how do you see white wines factor in when it comes to how Paso is with how warm we get and the diurnal temperature swings? Talk a little bit about that.
So white grapes in general, you're going to be working essentially a month earlier than you are on reds for the most part. So our latest ripening white around here, which is generally Picpoul, you're talking first week of October, whereas with your latest ripening reds, you're talking first week of November per se. So it's still early by red standards, but a first week of October pick for white wine is pretty darn late in general, which is something unique about Picpoul. Most of the whites around here are done by then, although there's some little pockets. I mean, there's one vineyard behind Brecken, the Grenache Blanc, that picks like the first week of November, and it's the most beautiful looking clusters coming out of there. It's bizarre. But I picked my Grenache Blanc the first week of September, kind of thing. So some of the location has a lot to do with it, but in general, Picpoul tends to be the latest. And I would say most of the white wines off the vine in the area in September for the most part. But I think a lot of what you get from this Picpoul or from that varietal in general with its later ripening is you get kind of more of a kaleidoscope of flavors as a result, because it hangs out there longer. So you get kind of a mix of tropical that's indicative of higher ripeness levels and later ripening, but you also get a lot of citrus and lime and lemon that are indicative of earlier ripening varietals. So you kind of get the best of both worlds with a variety like Picpoul that can handle the heat, can hang that late. And it's kind of a hybrid wine in a sense that, to me, it has all this early ripening season citrusy and high acid notes at a lower sugar and lower alcohol, but then there's this gorgeous tropical quality on the nose and the palate as well that's indicative more of late season ripening. So there is a benefit. Years like 2020 where we had a cool summer, but the hottest harvest that's ever been recorded in the last 30 years around here, those early season picks were extremely difficult. The grapes just flat out weren't ready before the heat hit, and they were past ready when you could pick, essentially. And so they were more at the whim of heat at that point. Generally, by the first week of October, when I'm picking this Picpoul, we've pretty much regulated at that point. The heat spikes, if they do come, you're talking mid 90s, or if it even gets close to 100, it's maybe for an hour or two during the day before it cools off very quickly. So it's nice and unique to have that extra month essentially of hang time with this particular varietal. And really for whites, it's pretty rare, and it's kind of the one grape that really gives me that luxury just to hang it and get past all the early season heat spikes that are more dramatically affect harvest than they do later in the season. So I kind of like that luxury of it. But second, on top of Molly's note, when it comes down to the long growing season, I envy her because she just does Rhone varietals there. So Alta Colina gets to pick out in generally 4 or 5 weeks for the most part. I make, oh, come on. It's never been that, maybe 2020.
8 weeks.
8 weeks. Well, usually because I pick whites, Zinfandels, Rhones, and Bordeaux's, I start generally last week of August in a lot of years and don't end till the first week of November. So we're talking a full, 10, 11 weeks for the most part. It is a long season here, especially when you do the full spectrum of varietals. And that.
Hey, Ryan, I have a question that popped up that I'd love to interrupt you with is, when does Uni Blanc come in?
So the Uni's almost always like clockwork the first week of September. I think if memory serves me right, it's always between the 3rd and the 9th of September for the most part, no matter what happens during the season. And so that one tends to be, and that's a more citrus driven wine. I don't want a lot of alcohol with it, but it actually ends up chemistry wise, the Uni is almost the same as the Picpoul, but the Picpoul picks a month later. But the Uni Blanc is on a little bit more of an intense exposure. It has smaller berries in smaller clusters that ripen a little bit quicker, but that's generally first week of September.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks for answering that. We also had another question real quick about the Cab Franc. Hey, we're going to show some images of where the Cab Franc is, but real quickly, Damian, it's right next to the tasting room, right?
Those old vines are Cabernet Sauvignon there. It's a little further up the vineyard, higher up the hill. But yeah, I mean, essentially, they're those gnarly old vines right next to the tasting room, but just a little further back.
Got it. Got it.
There is another interesting point about late harvest varietals generally, and is they have a slightly tougher skin. You wouldn't, because, you know, think traditionally in Europe, you sort of start heading into the rains and things, and if you get rains, you can get molds. So Cabernet Sauvignon is a late variety, Cabernet Franc's a great variety, Mourvèdre's got a reasonably tough skin. If you had something soft skinned like Zinfandel, and you get a big rain at the end of the season, the berries can swell up and split, and then you have all sorts of problems. And they also tend to have open bunches. With the traditional Bordeaux varieties, the later ones will have, the berries are quite spaced apart. So therefore, again, if you get a rain and the berries start swelling up, they don't split by putting pressure against each other. Now, Mourvèdre is not quite like that. But so generally later varieties have these open bunches and tougher skins, I think you'll find.
With the tougher skins, and this is for the three of you, whoever wants to take it though, what does that translate into then for tannin? I mean, is there going to be a lot of natural tannin that's coming out of these grapes?
Not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily quite. Sure, all the flavor and the color is in the skins. Doesn't mean that a tougher skin gives you a heavier tannin load. You know, and I had a great example on my tip of my tongue there, and the Cab Franc may be it. It's an older clone, and it has never given us a lot of tannin of them like the modern clones. And so these old vine Cab is exactly the same. It's pretty mild on the tannins. It's almost like a Grenache sometimes when it comes in and you go, ooh, where's the structure going to come from? It eventually comes there, but it's not like these modern clones that are very monomeric into tannins and very extracted even. So there isn't a clear correlation there, I don't think.
Yeah, and Mourvèdre can be harshly tannic, but I ferment them generally 100% whole cluster. So half the fermentation is a carbonic fermentation essentially. So it gives it a little more approachability and a softer tannin profile. And then, yeah, like Damian was saying, the fruit of Brecken, being an older clone, older vines have very soft tannin to them. But a lot of the newer, more modern clones of Cabernet and Cabernet Franc in the area are very tannic, very chewy, very rich late in the season. So it just kind of depends on your clonal material and your fermentation style, how the tannins manifest themselves from the thicker skin varietals.
Yeah. Molly, you want to chime in on that? I mean, when it comes to the management of Mourvèdre anyway, since we're talking about that from your vineyard, how does that factor in then with these? Because Mourvèdre's kind of a tannic wine in general. Does that factor in kind of funny for you guys since you have this really great exposure there? I mean, are you managing macerations a little differently with Mourvèdre?
Yeah, it's actually, you know, we get a little bit of the opposite, is that I'm trying to actually build tannins up in our Mourvèdre. So we have some decent color, but we don't quite have the amount of tannins that we need to bind all that color and keep it. So just naturally in the skins. So I do about 30% whole cluster, where like Ryan's talking about, he takes from our vineyard, he's going 100% whole cluster. So for those that aren't familiar with whole cluster fermentation, or where the tannins break down, is When you're fermenting whole cluster, you're leaving the stems on there, and there's a lot of tannins that are present in the stems. And so that helps us. So I usually don't do 100%. Like I said, I'm going about 30% right now. Next year, I'll probably try to push it just a little bit more. Also a little bit contrary. This is where everything is so site specific with vineyards, you know, as Damian's talking about the Grenache not having a lot of tannins, and we have a ton of tannins with our Grenache here. So even though our Grenache and Mourvèdre ripen pretty differently, this year I was able to keep some Grenache to co-ferment with Mourvèdre. So what I'm really loving to do is try to do a little bit of a co-ferment with some whole cluster as well, because I'm actually trying to bring more tannins in just to try and keep all that color that's already in the grape. So again, very site specific, but as far as my red varietals go here, Mourvèdre is my least tannic. So I've got high elevation Syrah that can be very tannic, and Grenache that if not managed properly, the tannins can run away from you as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that. Does that have to do with maybe the different soil types that you have from everybody else?
You know, it can. My experience though, as well at Halter Ranch, was that running phenolic analysis, we're able to see exactly how much color and tannin is in the wine at any time, whether it's, you know, at a point during fermentation or the finished wine. And generally speaking, we would find decent color in Mourvèdre, but our tannins are always falling short. And so I think Mourvèdre and whole cluster lend themselves to each other, because over the years, just through tasting, people have gone, oh, this Mourvèdre tastes great, but it's falling off. So we have this beautiful entry, and then it just is kind of gone. So let's try, like, how do we build that up? So yes, it's beautiful for GSM because you put in some Grenache that has no color and high tannins, and a little Syrah that's kind of your backbone, and it's a beautiful blending wine. Or you can start finding other ways to bring tannins in. And because the varietal it's like a medium bodied varietal. It's not as big as your big Syrahs. Sure, it can be made in that style, but just generally speaking, Mourvèdre has pretty large berries depending on the clone. And so it's not coming out of the bat as a super intense wine. And so we're finding other ways to kind of build that intensity into it.
Wild. Okay. Really cool. Thank you. Let's get into having some wine, right? That's what we're kind of talking about. We're going to start with, and this is a really cool label. I'm going to ask you about this here in a second, but it is the Terre Picpoul Blanc. And this is the first 2020 wine that I am about to enjoy. And I know that it is one heck of a vintage.
Yeah.
But thank you for sharing this. Talk a little bit about this wine, Ryan.
Yeah, so we started making Picpoul in 2017, I believe, if I remember correctly. I used to work with this fruit when I worked under Neil Collins at Lonborg. I would say he was the one that essentially taught me how to make white wine. And obviously with his experience at Tablas Creek and Lonborg, was very instrumental in our white wine style. But when they planted their own Picpoul at Old Oak Vineyard on Willow Creek Road, this fruit became available and we jumped on it in a heartbeat. And this was the second wine we made in the portfolio. We started with the Uni Blanc. This was basically trying to create a Mediterranean style white program. And when I say Mediterranean white, I mean no oak, very high acidity, very mineral, wines that you should be having with seafood or really fresh, you know, farmers market fare. Something that Tablas Creek has shown is very possible here in Paso for a very long time, but very few were doing. And basically the wine that inspired this style and this wine in general was the Vermentino at Tablas Creek. And when I had the Vermentino years back, I mean, at least 10 years ago or so, I just went, wow, why aren't more people making white wine like this around here? And pursued that on my own. And then lo and behold, I end up at Brecken, where I get to make some work with Damian to make some absolutely beautiful Albariños that are in a similar vein as well. But the inspiration of this wine is literally, I love Glenrose Vineyard. I had worked with it at Lonborg, and had already had a deft hand with how to use this fruit. But it worked in the style that we wanted to work with, and the whole idea of doing these obscure, more blending grapes and trying to do them really well. So this wine comes from two spots at Glenrose, and this is what's so unique about this wine and why there's kind of what I was describing earlier. There's two profiles in this wine. There's a huge citrus component and a huge tropical component. And that's because there's two blocks there. And one is on a south-facing, what we call the summit there, the top of the hill. It gets very tropical stone fruit. All the tropical ripe notes come from it. And then there's a ridge line, which is basically a terrace that faces due east, that's at the bottom of the hill. And it sees very little sunshine. It pretty much only gets morning sun and is completely shaded in the afternoon. And it's very tense, very mineral, very limey, lemony, very austere. And I picked the two at the exact same time, press them together and ferment them together. And so you kind of get essentially two wines in one, which is what's unique about this. And it's very rare at a vineyard that you have two completely extreme exposures of the same grape that actually surprisingly ripen at the same time at completely different chemistry and flavor profiles. And I think if you fermented them separately, they would be too extreme in their own right. And the best wine is made by putting them together and co-fermenting them and kind of putting it together in this package. And I call this is my fish taco wine. I love to have this with Pier 46 fish tacos. The tropical notes, the limey acidity plays perfect with them. And it's just a great, summer porch pounder at the same time too. And at 13.2% alcohol, you and a couple buddies can kill a few bottles and move on to red wine with dinner. It's kind of a beautiful thing.
That's awesome. So fish tacos as appetizers on the porch with this wine. Hey, talk about a little bit of, I'm looking at this picture and what's really interesting to me for a hot second, I'm like, they almost look like table grapes. It's almost like you're looking at maybe like a muscat even.
Yeah, it's a bigger berry, bigger cluster. That's a pretty small cluster by Picpoul standards because that's at the top of the hill on one of the rockiest sections that's fully exposed on both sides. But as you move down that terrace into the bottom, the vines are a lot more vigorous and the clusters are about almost 3 times larger than that particular cluster, and the berries get bigger, which hence why it's a later ripening varietal. They're by white wine standards, they're size wise close to Grenache Blanc size, but it ripens so much slower than Grenache Blanc, and it's hard to explain why necessarily, other than it has pretty good yields, pretty big berries, pretty big clusters, so it takes a lot longer to build that sugar in it. But it always, I think in the hottest of vintages in like 2017, I picked it the end of the last week of September, but 9 out of 10 times, this is the first week of October white wine. And we're talking 22 and a half bricks is all it is at that point, with a TA generally 6 to 7, pH 3.2 for the most part. So it just, from a winemaking standpoint, it's absolutely perfection of chemistry with great flavors with a month longer hang time than the other whites that I do. So it's pretty unique from that standpoint.
Right on. Molly, what do you think of this wine?
I really like this wine. So I love Pickled Blanc. I was lucky enough to work with it from 2011 through 2019. So I too have a lot of experience with this grape. And Picpoul is a colloquial term for lip stinger because this grape has so much acid in it. Mm-hmm. And I think to be a late ripening white in Paso, you have to have acidity. And that's why Picpoul can hang so long. A lot of times you're just going out and tasting, and it's just making you pucker. And then eventually it just all clicks. And it's beautiful. As Ryan said, you can pick this at a low bricks and it still just gives so much. And it's interesting. And when we started working with it, as we were tasting it and seeing the acid that was coming off, but we were going, like for a wine that's so racy, it still really provides a lot of body. And so, we started making Méthode Champenoise Picpoul Blanc at Halter because we thought it could withstand that. And normally when I think of really like racy acidic wines, they're going to be pretty lean, and Picpoul doesn't do that. And so it's really cool if you decide to, neutral barrel ferment Picpoul with lees inclusion or go tank fermented, you can get, again, completely different styles of the grape. And I think Ryan did a great job. This is beautiful. To me, there's a lot of lemon meringue. I get some cherimoya and persimmon on the nose. And the palate is just super bright and true to its name. And I thought it's got this really great zestiness that just kind of carries through and stays with you, and makes me definitely want to go to Pier 46 on my way home tonight.
Absolutely. Damian, you got the pleasure now of having Ryan in-house a little bit. You might be seeing a few more of these wines.
Well, that's interesting. And before we start, I just got to love the soil in that photograph. I'm all over that. I mean, I want to plant Syrah there, but I also take fruit from the same vineyard, so I'm very familiar with it. And look, I've made every variety under the sun in almost every wine region in the world, it seems, but I'd never made a Pickled Blanc. And so it's actually been quite an eye-opener for me to have Ryan in my winery making Pickled Blanc. And he's an early bird. He gets up and he's gone by 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And I'm a sort of a night owl, so I'm sneaking around the winery late at night, draining his Picpoul tank without him knowing, to educate myself on how Picpoul matures through the ferment and what have you. And look, I love the whole concept of acidity, late fruit, hanging, and we've got a patio and a commercial kitchen, and so we want a food-friendly wine that's going to have great acidity to cut through those things. Now, as Brecken Estate, we went down the Albarino line on that for that. But I can see absolutely why that Ryan goes down the Picpoul line. I've got no intention of doing a Picpoul. That's Ryan's thing, and we don't want to create a conflict of interest. So I'm happy with my Albarino hat, and but I can actually I can see absolutely a lot of merit in this one.
And Chris, I just wanted to touch on your remark about your first 2020 wine. I just want to say flat out, as a winemaker, the fact that we were even able to accomplish a vintage in 2020 is remarkable. I mean, considering the pandemic that's going on, the extremely hot harvest we had, and the wildfires that happened all over California, it seemed for a while that it was likely that we would not even have a vintage in some cases, and potentially everything be compromised. And I think seeing 2020 on a bottle is one of the greatest testaments to perseverance of just winemakers in general, but how lucky this area was to not be affected by the wildfires. And the only normal thing about 2020 was harvest, literally. And that no matter what happened last year, Mother Nature still grew us grapes and we still made wine. And despite all the obstacles, the 2020s are actually quite a gorgeous vintage, and I'm really looking forward to them rolling out. But it was, to me, the most rewarding vintage that I've done to date, simply because it was so in peril for so long that it may not even happen. And not only did it happen, but the wines are absolutely stunning and beautiful from the vintage. So we have something from 2020 that at the end of the year we can cheers glasses and celebrate that we have great wines, and we still got that out of such a trying year.
I love it. Thank you.
But isn't that precisely why we're talking about late varieties? Because you get past the heat, you go past the smoky atmosphere, you go past everything. And so not only is, Paso basically missed it all, and so Paso's a great bet for drinking a 2020 wine, but also if you combine that with these late varieties, there's no reason it can't be an excellent vintage.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And I think we're gonna start seeing some really amazing wines coming out of the region once they get into bottle and everything, which the red wines are, of course, a little ways away, but well, not right now, actually. They're not, because actually we're going to get into a red wine right now. And I think what we'll do is we'll go with the Sun Worshipper next. So Molly, I'm gonna kick it to you to talk a little bit about this wine. I'll put it up here. I have some slides as well, so I want to pull those up. And but next up is the Sun Worshipper. I love this. It's 88% Mourvèdre, 12% Syrah. Not a lot of it made, as you can see here. Labels. We're going to get back to labels eventually, Ryan, because I know I want to talk about yours. The Alta Colina label is so unique to if anything, showcasing the terroir out there. But Molly, take it away on the Sun Worshipper.
Yeah, well, I didn't mention this before, but Alta Colina is Spanish for high hill. So I did mention we have a high elevation vineyard site, and here you can see a great picture of it. This picture would actually be taken if you were a drone above the Mourvèdre, looking back at what we call toasted slope. So that big block is all Syrah, and there's a little Roussan to the right of the barn there. And then there is another block of Mourvèdre down there, and block 4 is that lower right block. So we are seeing kind of one block that's south facing, exactly. And then our larger block is block 11, which we would technically be hovering above right now. Oh, there you go. Perfect. So 4 and 11 are the exact same clone of Mourvèdre. And as you mentioned, this wine is called Sun Worshipper. So part of this is a testament to this being a late ripening varietal. So Mourvèdre worships the sun, and it loves that extra time. I think probably a lot of us throughout our career have experimented with trying to pick Mourvèdre early, because unlike Picpoul Blanc, Mourvèdre doesn't always hold its acidity. Obviously, it's site dependent, but Mourvèdre does trend to be a little bit of a higher pH wine. However, so, I've experimented with trying to pick really early, and it's just not happy. It really wants that longer hang time. So I think that's what really creates the beautiful aspects with Mourvèdre. As you mentioned, this wine is 12% Syrah. So Sun Worshipper has always been a blend, a Mourvèdre-based blend. It is going more and more in the higher percentage of Mourvèdre. And my hope is that we can eventually get this wine to 100% Mourvèdre. I just think it would be a very beautiful expression from the property. So in 2017, that was, if people remember that year, was when the drought ended for us. So we had been running on 12 to 14 inches of rain a year. Very sad. And along came 2017, and in West Adelaide, we got 43 inches of rain. So it was quite a different year. It was really interesting because we got this crazy heat spike in July, and then another crazy heat spike in September. And it threw a lot of things out of whack. It was really funny, actually, tying back to Picpoul Blanc. I remember in 2017, we had some cavitation in our Picpoul Blanc, and it ended up holding on till the first week of November, and I picked it at 19 bricks. And I made the wine, put it in a tank, and thought, I'm going to bulk this out. Like, there's no way this is going to be a decent wine. And I went back 2 months later and smelled the tank and was like, oh my gosh, I have never smelled such like amazing crushed pineapple and just cool things coming out of Picpoul Blanc. And it was 11.2% alcohol. So 2017 was just a strange year. Like I said, we got all this rain, we got these crazy heat spikes. But overall, we had people's yields were pretty high. But sometimes when we get those higher yields, we don't quite have the same intensity. So being able to have a little bit of Syrah to blend back in and kind of pick up the wine helps with this particular cuvee. So I really like this wine. I think, as you mentioned, there's but just 210 cases were produced. I think technically we're sold out, but we have like a hidden stash of 8 cases lying around in the back. And to me, it's just like the nose. I just put my nose in it. It was like pops of berrylicious. It's got this super cool mulberry, dark plum, olalla berries. And to me, it's just really complex and layered. Like I just kept wanting to smell more and more. And then the palate's just really soft and juicy. Yeah, it has all these dried cherries and cranberries. And to me, it's just got this great tenacity to it. So talking about Mourvèdre being a lower acid grape, but you can feel the strength in this wine. And to me, it really carries through and gives it a nice long finish. A little bit of that Syrah helps just kind of prop up the back end there. But the Mourvèdre's really fun. Like I said, we have 2 blocks on the property. We just finished tasting through every barrel of the 2019. And the differences between block 4 and block 11 are so interesting. Like they create completely different styles of Mourvèdre. And I don't want to give it away too much because I don't want Ryan to try and change what block he's buying from us. Just kidding. You can come try them anytime, Ryan. But it's just, to me, is so interesting, the different characteristics we can get with just the same clone, but different aspects. So block 11 being our larger block, it's our older block as well. And it's pretty much lying on the top of the hill with part of it kind of trailing a little bit to south facing, where block 4 is just all south facing and it's on the bottom of the slope. So we get really different characteristics. And yeah, it's been a really fun varietal for me to play around with here. This year I did a ton of experimentations on different fermentation temperatures, stem inclusion levels, co-fermentation. The thing that's really nice, and some people might think it's a challenge, but we do fermentations in 1.5 ton macro bins. So we call them 48S's. And at first you think, oh man, I don't have tanks with valves and stainless steel, everything. But the great thing is that every single one is a different experimentation vessel for me. So now I can pull one lot, and instead of just having, 5 tons in a tank, I have 3 different experiments I can do. And so I've been getting to play around and really learn all of the varietals in the vineyard. And Mourvèdre, even though I'm pretty tired by the time Mourvèdre comes in, it's been fun to play around with. And yeah, Ryan, I will say, like, coming from Halter, making Ronan Bordeaux, I got here, I'm like, hey, Bob, can't wait for my 5-week harvest. And he's like, yeah, right, it's always 8 weeks. And I didn't believe him. We were 7 weeks and 6 days this year.
Okay.
I was like, what? I thought I'm only making rooms and it's a high elevation site. So this is by far our last pick,
Yeah.
but it's, and Ryan knows because you get fruit right around the same time as we pull from it. So
How's fermentation with Mourvèdre? Is it, is it an extended time period that you spend on it?
yeah, I mean, for me, because I'm trying to build up those tannins a bit more, just because it's not what I have just naturally coming out, I do end up leaving it on skins a little bit longer. But Mourvèdre is really interesting. We always call it like oatmeal in the press pan. So it's like whenever you go, it's just like really sloshy. Like if you ever use, here we have a bladder press, but if you ever use it in a basket press, like a pneumatic basket press, like you take the cake off and it just kind of like just melts. So it's kind of like this gushy oatmeal. So I try to do extended maceration, but I don't go too long. So we're usually looking at somewhere in the 2 to 3 week range.
I don't know if that was Mourvèdre that I put in that punch down picture. I just really loved the texture of the picture, but it looked really sloppy. And so I thought, well, maybe it is. And then that other picture of somebody picking, I saw that little secondary, but little clustery thing hanging off the side. And I thought that kind of does that. Like it has these funny little, secondary. So I don't know if it was or not. I think
yeah, no, they were. And it has these really like long clusters, and I mean, depends on the clone, of course. But it's kind of a funny grape. Sometimes you get those weird little sideshow bob clusters and you're taking the shoulders off, and yeah, it's a fun one. And the color,
fermenter, to say the least.
Yeah.
It's ugly.
It's mushy. It just is kind of oatmeal-y. But the cool thing about Mourvèdre is the color. Like to me, the color, like when you look at Mourvèdre, you just know whether it's coming out of a fermenter or usually in a glass, it's, some wines just have these like dark red or these really bright colors. And Mourvèdre is like this dark magenta. So it has this real like mauve color scheme to it. It's like a mauve purple that I just think is really unique. And yeah, the pumice is always a completely different color than everything else that comes through also.
So I want to take just a quick second for you guys also to talk a little bit about your impressions of this wine, Ryan, and then Damian, and we'll get into this this Cab Franc here. But I'll kick it to Damian real quick. Just your impressions of Molly's wine.
Well, full disclosure, I've also taken this fruit in a previous life, so I'm quite familiar with it. And I think, you know, it's a very good expression of a hilltop Mourvèdre. The key difference here is if you plant Mourvèdre down the slope or in a slightly cooler spot, it comes even later. But that's where you start getting the earthy tones that are not necessarily in this wine. And so traditionally what we do at Brecken is when we're making Mourvèdre, we take some hilltop fruit and we take some stuff that's a little lower down the throat, the slope, trying to give it a little more complexity. But there's no right or wrong answer. It's just stylistically what we're doing. So the Alta Colina is a silicious soil. It's very hilltop. It's very fruit forward from a Mourvèdre standpoint. There are other expressions of Mourvèdre, you know, we try and sort of stick our foot in both camps and have both styles in our wine in the same way that Ryan with his Picpoul was trying to pick two different expressions of the fruit and blend them together. So yeah, and personally, I prefer the hilltop fruit forward expression, but a lot of people like a little bit of that earthy tone in there, and so that's why we try to do it with our own brand.
Right on, right on. Ryan, you are a Mourvèdre guy. You dig this stuff?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, you know, Molly's term of this melange of berries, and to me, I would take that melange of berries and I'd put it on top of an old horse saddle, and if you smell that, that's how I describe this wine, because there's this dusty, earthy, old saddle leather thing to me that's very prevalent in this wine. I source specifically for Paix Terre from Block 11 from Alta Colina, and have been since 2012. Although we do ours 100% whole cluster, and there's a lot of similarities in the wines, but a lot of differences at the same time too. And there's no right or wrong in either expression necessarily. And I think it's just an absolutely beautiful expression that shows a little bit more fruit to it. And I think I'm excited to see what Molly does with these wines, because Bob was so averse to whole cluster in the past. And I think it's gonna be interesting to see what Molly does going forward with this fruit. Yeah. And I just think this is a beautiful wine. But I think what Molly's starting to bring stems into the equation can bring even more earthiness and tannic structure to this wine, while maintaining the integrity of the fruitiness at the same time too. Because I've only done 100%. I mean, I destemmed the first, I think, 2 vintages of it, and you get a little bit more of a tarry, richer, dark fruit expression. But as you bring stems in, you get a little more structure, mineral, and elegance to the wine. And I think Molly's going to play a big part in kind of bringing that expression into this wine, which I'm pretty excited about. But a unique thing about the Alta Colina Block 11 specifically is it's a rare, I describe it as a plateau. It's not really, does lean slightly south, but it is literally almost a flat plateau at an extremely high elevation. So it doesn't have an extreme ripeness on one side of the vine or the other, or an under ripeness per se. It's pretty homogeneous all the way across. And so when you're on the sorting table or you're tasting things in the fermenter, it's so consistent. It's by far of the sites I work with, it's the site that every cluster tastes very similar to each other, which gives me a consistency of understanding of how to work with this fruit on a yearly basis. Whereas a lot of vineyards, you have 2 kind of extreme exposures on each side of the vine, being that you're on a slope, generally with either a due east or west or south, north, south, depending on how the row orientation is. But this is a rare plateau. It's rare that you have this flat of ground at this high elevation anywhere, which I think is part of the unique expression of this wine.
Yeah, right on. Well, everyone, I know this is called the Paso Wine Hour, and we're actually at an hour, but we're going to keep going because we got another wine. We want to talk to Damian about this Cab Franc that we have in glass right now. real quick, here's the bottle that there are only about 100 bottles left, I believe is what you said, Damian. I'm going to throw a couple of images up here for you in just a second. But really curious as you're talking as to where the name Brecken comes from as well. So while you're talking about Cab Franc, if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
I'm actually curious to whether that's a Mourvèdre vine growing out of the back of Molly's chair, or is it something else? Because I know there's no Cab Franc over there. So Brecken is, you know, we like things that tie in a lot of things for us, and we're actually looking at the Brecken Cabernet Franc right in front of us. Those first vines are Cabernet Franc. But the soil is actually very much like the soil in that Pickled Blanc. It's just the grass has grown up and you can't see it. It's hilltop. And, you know, most of the hilltops around Paso, people put Cabernet Sauvignon on it because it gives them the best return on investment, and that's the traditional thing. So it was really quite a visionary planting to put Cabernet Franc on top of a hilltop. And, you know, what it does is it gets past a lot of what we call pyrazine. You know, a lot of people associate it with the varietal character of Cabernet Franc because after all, they grow Cabernet Franc in Bordeaux, they grow it in Pennsylvania, they grow it more or less everywhere. And there's a lot of people, that's what they first are exposed to Cabernet Franc as. And so when they come across something like the Brecken Cabernet Franc, which is like a super ripe version of a Cabernet Franc, without being jammy or anything, it kind of blows them away because they're not used to getting past that, and they almost think it's not a Cabernet Franc, but it is. It's when you have a site that has the long hang time and you're picking late, and it you know, doesn't get so hot that you're getting the sugars blow out. You get this very almost elegant wine, and it's something that you don't need a big cab, especially in the summer, to have with a steak. It can be a Cabernet Franc and or a Sangiovese or something. Now, when it comes in and it's picking really late, we throw it in the ferment, and I'm not sure Ryan's actually seen this yet. It can smell like tea leaves while it's in the ferment, and it can do that for about 4 or 5 months afterwards, and you think, oh, I don't know about this, is going to be really strange, but it comes around to this very, very sort of elegant thing. Now, in Brecken, which is a town in Wales where I come from, it's also a national park called the Brecon Beacons. They drink a lot of tea, and so you know, it has that remind me of home sort of thing. But so does the calcareous soils, because the Brecon Beacons, that national park, are underlain by limestone. And I was a caver, or still am really, I suppose. And I used to explore all these caves, and that's essentially why I bought a winery on the limestone soil. Was, you know, I used to travel the world, sticking my head down all these holes around the world, the longest and the deepest in the world, and getting really miserably wet and muddy. And then I thought, well, sod that. I'm going to go and stick my head down a hole in a nice warm Mediterranean climate, and calcareous soils and caves, and that's kind of it. So that's how we ended up in California. So it has meaning to us on a number of levels. Now, the vines are getting old. I mean, they're about 45 years old, I think, at the moment. And we are, having said that we're running out of this wine, we made 2 wines in 2018. Not only did we make the estate version here, which is 90% Cabernet Franc and a little bit of the old vine cab as well. So there's 10% or 11% old vine cab in it. And yes, they are getting pretty gnarly and old, and we haven't pruned those particular ones yet. But we also did a clonal trial where we were trying different clones from different vineyards around here to try and work out what we're going to plant next at Brecken alongside these vines. And it was very, very interesting because, you know, the clone that you thought was maybe, oh, that's the biggest, the boldest, the strongest, or whatever, it didn't play well with this. So we ended up, you know, this is an old crooner, if you like, and you know, it's socially inept. It only blends well with some of the things it likes, its buddies, if you like. So we spent a lot of time looking around to try and find the right clone to plant at Brecken. We found it. It's in the ground. We should get our first crop this year. But back in 2018, we weren't at that stage, but we were bringing in fruit from other people. So we do have another Cab Franc. So when this runs out, you'll be able to get Cab Franc from Brecken, and it still has a big chunk of Brecken Cab Franc in it. But it's interesting. We're going to be making more. We are planning for the future, it's a wine that it's a gentle giant, if you will, of Cabernet Franc. It doesn't have necessarily the color and structure of a modern clone. These older vines give you something a little bit more broader in the palate. Every time you taste it, you get a slightly different inflection, and it's not, it's certainly not a one-dimensional thing. So we have originally had about 8.5 acres of this. We pulled a little bit out, and we've replanted another 2 acres. So right now we're sort of between plantings, but as the new planting comes on, we'll have a little bit more.
This wine is absolutely magnificent. It's so delicious. It really it begs for food, actually, to go along with it.
I think that's why the Soms like it, because they're not looking something for big and bold to dominate that beautiful food they've just put in front of you. They want something to complement it, that's smooth and lets the conversation flow for the rest of the evening. Now, a lot of people talk about food as a pairing, and I actually often go back to location. My favorite pairing for this is sitting on the barn roof with the sunset and then the stars later in the evening. Now, it's not something that the Surgeon General would recommend, because you're going to fall off that barn roof. And he's a pretty conservative kind of guy, I'm sure. But that's my favorite pairing: barn roof, sunset, starlight.
So yours is that we can start with the Picpoul with fish tacos on the porch.
Put a foundation in there.
And then somewhere in the middle there, we're having the sun worshiper, likely out in the sun, I think, because it's just such a delightful wine. What do you guys think of this wine? Molly, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, I think this wine is great. It's, you put your nose in the glass and right away you're just like, oh, that's a Bordeaux. Like, I'm back in Bordeaux land. And to me, Cab Franc is a tricky varietal. And it really site specific, and there's a lot of iris in Cab Franc, which causes some other characteristics, which we don't have time for right now. But to me, this has the right amount of pyrazines. Like, you smell it, and I think anyone would put their nose in it and go, this is a Cab Franc, where there's just that right amount of kind of greenness and pyrazines, but it also is super balanced and has this like tanned hide and leather thing going on the nose that I really enjoy. And I think the palate's, it's beautiful. It's really red, and it's got these earth characteristics. I get a lot of wet clay, but really balanced. Again, has a lot of tenacity to this wine. The acid is bright and strong. And to me, it's just beautifully balanced from the beginning to the middle to the finish. It's this really long wine, and yeah, well done.
Nice. Ryan, you get to play with this stuff now.
Yeah, this wine was kind of a fun, kind of came out of our blending sessions. And it was my first year going through this process with Damian. And I remember when we got all the bench trials together to do the Bordeaux run, blending trials. And, we had nearly 500 cases of Cabernet Franc in barrel. And I'm just thinking, well, we can't make 500 cases of Cabernet Franc. That's nuts. That's a large production of one varietal and putting all of your marbles in one place. And so when we tasted through all the lots, it was including the experimental lots from other vineyards when they were looking at what clone to put on the property, and then the estate. And to me, the estate stood out above the others. And it was pretty clear to me, well, and as I said to Damon, I said, well, have you ever done a reserve Cab Franc? And I don't believe we had to that point. I said, well, why don't we, because it's our estate and this stands above the others, do a reserve and then do our regular Cab Franc as a blend of the other clones and the other sites that we were working with a little bit of estate in it. And that's kind of how this wine came out. And I'm so glad we went this direction because both Cab Francs are beautiful, but this really showcased the old vines at Brecken and how special they are. And we don't know how much longer those vines are going to give us this kind of wine. I mean, just with as Damian mentioned earlier, the viruses and things that come along with old vines, you don't know how long you're going to get this for, kind of thing. And this was a unique expression and a great vintage where we could showcase it on its own and give it its own bottling and put it in their beautiful reserve packaging line, and showcase the estate. So I love where this wine came from as far as just the blending session and how it manifested itself. And I'm just so glad we kept the purity of the Brecken estate as its own expression and then let the others kind of be their own thing.
Yeah, right on. Right on. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. We're well over time, but this has been a really great discussion. I've really enjoyed it. We've had some great comments come through. Also, I know that there were a lot of questions out there, but we are just right about out of time. And so my apologies for not getting to them, but email each of these winemakers. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Next week, we are going to be talking to the Wine History Project. So this will be March 4th. For some of you that were trying to tune in on Zoom, our apologies, but somehow that link on pasowine.com wasn't working for you. And so we're gonna fix that for next week, of course. But thank you for everybody joining us over there on Facebook. Next week, Wine History Project, we're gonna be talking about their new book coming out. We'll have a couple of winemakers on board that have a long-standing history in our region, of course. And then once we get into March, because March is all about Zinfest here in Paso, we'll be talking a lot about Zinfandel in the region. I want to thank all of our panelists today. So Damian Grindley from Brecken Estate, Ryan Pease, Paix, Terre, and Molly Lonborg with Alta Colina. Thank you so much for being on today. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys. Pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Right on. We'll see you next time.
Bye now.